Now then, I'm going to be recovering a lot of the same ground I did in our discussion on zombies, so try to keep all of that in mind as I discuss something that, at first glance, is the exact same, but under the surface there are a lot of differences, and I'd like to begin with those. See, today we are going to be talking about what is simply called the skeleton, and more accurately should be called the animated skeleton. Now, from most people's point of view, there's going to be no real difference between them. Even some necromancers might not know the difference between them as well, since you use a lot of the same spells to animate either one or the other, and the same force and power is what animates both of them upon the spells taking effect. So from all of those similarities being stated, you might think that any differences are trivial. Well, I think there are some things that are worth pointing out for those who truly care about the magical processes behind such things. So, for a start, it's actually a little harder to animate a skeleton than it is a zombie. Because the hollow spirit that inhabits these beings, when they do so with a zombie, they can use the remaining tissue to essentially animate themselves, not really needing any more help from the caster. Whereas the skeletons have little to no tissue left, meaning that the actual caster needs to avert more control over them to keep them animated. It's not so much needing to concentrate on it, just needing to put more power into it. As a little side tangent, this is actually the best way to tell them apart. See, the name skeleton is actually a little misleading. A zombie is a corpse that could reasonably get back up again on its own. All of its body is for the most part still there and would be capable of working were it alive. A skeleton is a reanimation that is something that could not get back up on its own. It is missing far too much, or is simply just too damaged to begin with, requiring actual magic to animate it. And due to this extra control that is needed, you could actually make up a skeleton from multiple people's bones if you lacked some for whatever reason. Actually, this goes so far that you can make all sorts of abominations out of bone with the remains of mismatched creatures, resulting in some absolutely terrifying creations. And a very skilled necromancer could even go as far as to reanimate pure bone dust to mold it into a more physical shape again. The reason this is almost never done is because at that point it's not really worth it. When they're that skilled, they can usually make a more powerful form of spectral undead. The reason it is sometimes done is to remold bone, to add extra bits to it, to reshape them. Anyway, back to my main point. This more control over the animated subjects means that they just cannot function without the caster. Back to the topic on zombies. When the caster is to die, the spirit is essentially free to have more control over itself. Zombies go out and kill everything they can when they do this. But because the skeleton can't really function on its own, they will just drop into their animated bodies. The spirit put within them will then usually fail to gain any ground and return back to where it came from. This is why the more, shall I say, moral necromancers of society usually limit themselves in what forms they're allowed to make, and are almost exclusively making skeletons if they animate the dead at all, mostly because the chance of collateral damage is kept to an absolute minimum. Of course, that's not a guaranteed. Every now and again, one spirit might be strong enough to maintain the reins of power, so to speak, letting the skeleton go off and control itself. And of course, if a really powerful spellcaster animates a skeleton, that's almost a guaranteed. So it's a very case-by-case basis, but it is a rare occurrence naturally. So with this chance of failure taken into account, I would say that animating a skeleton is not a neutral act. There is some risk and evil brought into the world when you cast these spells. However, to say that they are on par to a zombie is ridiculous. Making a skeleton is clearly much more of a moral act than a zombie. The argument is whether the risk is worth it or not. Of course, those who care little for morals would almost always pick the zombie since they are easier to animate, and they usually stay up longer since they've just got more flesh on them. Now, you might be surprised about how freely I am talking about information that is, well, rather evil. And the main reason, of course, is because knowledge is power. Yes, I will be informing all necromancers to be on how they could easily animate these things, potentially saving them years of study to do these evil acts. But I'm also telling everyone on how these things work. I'm informing them of how they should end these threats as well. should they wish to, of course. I should also note that a lot of my research is first-hand. Unlike most who study these things, I have actually casted these spells and know how to animate the dead. The experience is quite hollowing, and I mean that quite literally. It's almost as if you feel a part of yourself being taken away in the process. It makes you feel more dead. You're more apathetic with each casting. With time, these feelings do pass, and I return to my usual mindset, but I can only imagine what one young, misguided spellcaster could end up doing with this affecting them. You're not even fully aware this is happening until you're out of that mindset. The reason I'm bringing this topic up is because of the slippery slope that skeletons allow. The fact that they are so risk-free allows you to argue that they are a neutral act instead of an evil one, means that you can be misguided. Because the more of these spells you cast, the more willing you are to do so again, and the little more you care for morality. I have even seen a few spellcasters fall into this trap. They'll only make a few skeletons, then after the years they're combining them together to make more mismatched and practical sorts of creatures, and then after some time they just give up and start making zombies. It's more practical this way, and they can understand how to control them now. But it results in the zombies somehow breaking free, or even worse, the spellcaster no longer caring for morality and turning to more evil acts. I suppose to put it simply, due to the effects animating necromancy has on the body and mind, it makes animating skeletons a gateway spell into more dangerous ones. Sure, the apprentice has only created a skeleton chicken for now, but watch her and in a few years she'll be making entire hordes of zombies to decimate villages. Of course, that example is a little bit ridiculous, but if you do know any spellcasters, specifically wizards, who are learning necromancy, you should probably keep an eye on them. Now, back to the skeletons themselves, really anything can become a skeleton. It just needs to have a more structural makeup to its being, and the spellcaster needs to be powerful enough. Again, the name skeleton is a little misleading because the creature doesn't actually have to have a skeleton to be animated in the way we refer to as skeletons. Just a structure that is no longer functioning on its own given false life. And technically speaking, a skeleton can form into any shape, as you can rearrange any mismatched collection of bones, or just animate bone dust into a shape you would prefer. This is really if you are desperate, or perhaps hyper-creative. I'm sure if I viewed myself as a magical artist and had no sense of morality, I would make all sorts of skeletal monstrosities just to see how far I could take it. If I was that type of person, of course, which I assure you I'm not. Now, there's one more creepy thing I wish to get into before I tell my tale I have of the skeletons, and that is that they are in perfect unison. See, because of the more hands-on control that is needed to animate skeletons, this often means that they are more like puppets than the zombies are. Both have the same type of spirit, it just has no control when it's a skeleton rather than a zombie. So if a necromancer has an army of skeletons next to an army of zombies, you would see the zombies shamble like you would expect, but the skeletons would march in perfect unison. One foot always landing at the exact same time, regardless of the size of the army. If you were to give those same skeletons bows and arrows, they would all aim and fire them in perfect unison. This is another reason skeletons are used for workers more so than zombies, because they could easily give each other the equipment and do the same jobs right after each other. Almost like automatons. In fact, that's almost what they are, dead walking automatons. Now then, the tale I have of the skeletons is more so about a small civilization that utilized them. Actually, their culture made it mandatory. See, there is a people far to the south in a desert of sand, but there is also a large jungle within their domain, I should note. They have a more primitive culture. They have some finely built structures and some beautiful walls, but nothing as vast as a fast-sprawling city. But their culture had formed around ancestor worship. Now, this combined with a mandatory service to their society in the forms of both hard labor and some form of military career, it resulted in them animating the skeletons of their dead in order to fulfill the quotas they failed to meet in life. Over many years, this resulted in a cultural shift where the living never worked on the harder jobs and only the dead did so. yet they were paradoxically the most respected members of society. When I first met these people, I saw a collection of clergymen praying to the skeletons who were building their temple. It was quite the bizarre sight. Of course, there were troubles that came from this, and if you are even slightly knowledgeable about necromancy, you would know that it allows you to take control of already existing undead, not just make your own. So when a lich discovered this country, they saw it as free gain, and, with their very powerful nature, took control of the whole thing quickly, making their own ancestors kill their descendants. In the end, I was one of the many other adventurers called in to help free the people, but they actually cared more about the skeletons being controlled than their own freedom. Their focus was on making sure that the bodies of their ancestors were in no way harmed, and so we did our best. How we actually defeated the Lich is another story for another day. Just know that only a handful of skeletons were indeed harmed. There was little we could do. We did minimize the damage as much as we could. Those people are actually going through a little bit of a cultural reform of late. See, after that fiasco, they decided that instead of having a human king, they would much rather have a Lich king take over instead. Whether it is for the better or worse, only time will tell. Thank you for listening to my tales. I am the Ashspawn. Feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But, till next we meet, fellow traveller, have a good day.